The Renaissance was a time of learning and new discoveries between the 14th and 17th centuries. In this time period, mathematicians, scientists, and artists were making many new accomplishments, discoveries, and breakthroughs. Some were Michelangelo and Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer who created the heliocentric system. During this time period, Galileo Galilei was born to Vincenzo Galilei and Giulia degli Illuminati. He had two sisters named Virginia and Livia. Along with his two sisters was one brother named Michelangelo. His father noticed that Galileo was very intellectual and willing to learn. The family moved to Florence in 1574, where Galileo was then educated by the monks of the Camaldolci monastery.
In 1581, at the age of 17, Galileo began studying medicine at the University of Pisa. While at the university, Galileo noticed a lantern held by a long chain attached to the ceiling. He discovered that it was swinging back and forth, and he found that it took the same amount of time going the short way as it did the long. This may have been the beginning of his interest in physics and mathematics. A few years later, on January 7, 1610, Galileo found 4 perfectly round stars orbiting Jupiter. They ended up being its moons. Galileo concluded that, quote, "The Milky Way is nothing but a mass of innumerable stars planted together in clusters," unquote. In that same year, Galileo wrote a letter to Johannes Kepler. Within the letter, it discussed his discouragement about how he wanted people to follow his Copernican views. The letter stated, quote, "My dear Kepler, what would you say of the learned here, who, replete with the pertinacity of the ass, have steadfastly refused to cast a glance through the telescope? What shall we make of this? Shall we laugh, or shall we cry?" Unquote.
The Roman Catholics believed in Ptolemy's theory, which stated that the Earth was in the center of the solar system, as opposed to the Copernicus theory, which states that the Sun is the center of the solar system. During this time, the Roman Catholic Church had the most power in Europe. This meant that you had to follow what the Church said, and if you went against it, it would result in serious prosecution. In 1616, Galileo wrote up a theory about the Earth's tides, in which he argues to prove that the Earth rotates. He also wrote a treatise to Cardinal Alessandro Orsini. In September of 1624, he began to revise his treatise on tides, which eventually resulted in Galileo writing his book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Galileo published his book in February of 1625. This book discusses the Copernican and Ptolemaic systems. In the book, he discusses the difference between the two and which one is more probable. In August of that year, the Church bans the teaching and publishing of this book.
On October 1st of 1632, Galileo was immediately summoned before the Inquisitor of Rome for suspicions of grave heresy. In that same month, he was summoned before the Commissary General, where Galileo was ill with an irregular pulse, a weak stomach, insomnia, and a hernia. He obtained a special certificate signed by 3 doctors testifying to his illness. Part of this certificate said, quote, "If in the least aggravated, all of these symptoms may become dangerous to life," unquote. In late winter of 1632, Urban VIII, the Inquisitor, rejects Galileo's request to hold the Inquisition in Florence. He said that if Galileo doesn't come to Rome, he'll have him arrested and forced to come involuntarily. On January 20th, 1633, Galileo was forbidden any social contacts with the people in Florence. From April 12th to the 30th, Galileo was testified and sent to live in an apartment. On a later date in 1633, consultants of the Church examined Galileo's book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, and filed their complaints about the book. Once this took place, Galileo was in even more trouble and conflict with the Church than he had been before. In April of 1633, during Galileo's Inquisition, Galileo is allowed to bargain a plea. This may allow Galileo to have more of a lenient sentence. Within that same month, on April 30th, Galileo admits to have been using and displaying the Copernican view too strongly. As a result of his wrongdoing, he offered to admit and fix his wrong views in his next book, refuting about the subject in his future text.
June 22nd, 1633, a scary day for Galileo. He dressed in black and white and entered the Inquisition building. He knelt before the Inquisitor, Urban VIII, and listened to his sentence. His sentence stated, quote, whereas you, Galileo, the son of late Vincenzo Galilei, Florentine, aged 70 years, were in the year 1650 denounced to this holy office for holding as true the false doctrines, unquote. The sentence for Galileo then proceeded for another 17 grueling paragraphs. Later, after being threatened by a possible torture, Galileo was examined by the Inquisition once again. The next day, he is sent to prison. All of the inquisitors, non-believers, and religious penitents were more than glad to see him sent to prison. Although the Inquisition was successful for the cardinal and inquisitors, only 10 signed the sentence. In the formal ceremony at the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Galileo renounces his errors. After the ceremony, Galileo was told he could be under house arrest at his latest prosecution. He stays at the residence of the Tuscan ambassador. Later, he transfers to the Archbishop of Siena in that Tuscan city.
Once Galileo arrives at Siena, he uses his time and aloneness to put together his discourse or debate with the two new sciences. After all that Galileo has been through within the year of 1633, Galileo was granted permission to return to his house in Arce Tree near Florence. There, Galileo remained for the rest of his life. In winter of 1634, the hernia that Galileo had previously suffered from became more of a dilemma for him. He asked for permission from Rome to consult his physicians in Florence, but after all, the request was soon denied. In January of 1638, Galileo has now lost vision in both eyes. He petitions to have the Inquisition free him, but it is rejected. Although Galileo's vision is completely gone, the Inquisition still makes him suffer. However, they let him transfer to his house in Florence so he can be closer to his physicians.
In March, he obtains permission to attend church on religious holidays. He was granted permission, but forbidden any social contact with others. During a serious illness, Galileo prepares to conduct his last will and testament. On a sad, tragic day of January 6, 1642, Galileo passes away at the age of 77 in his house. He was a strong Catholic and a smart man. Aside from his views against the church, he was right. He never had a compromise of his tragic trial. At the end of his triumph and misfortune, discoveries, and hardships, some 359 years later, a compromise fell forth. On October 31st, 1992, after a 13-year discourse with the church, Pope John Paul II, in front of thousands, admitted to the church being wrong, and Galileo was, indeed, right. Time had put an end to the conflict that the Roman Catholic Church had with Galileo.